just don't know where I can begin. Hey, what I need is a good defense.
In this dissertation, I bring together over 60 primary early modern English texts which discuss, represent, or in some way connect to the practice of hospitality. What you are watching here is a vlog of my final days leading up to my dissertation defense, which, spoiler alert, I passed. That's right, I am recording this voiceover from the future as Dr. Glutenberg Bible. My defense took place on a Friday evening, which meant that I had the entire week to prepare, but I knew that with only that week left, there wasn't really that much I could do that would make me substantially more prepared than I already was. The real work of preparation had been the past 6 years of grad school, the past 2 years of dissertation writing, and everything that I could do in this week was just preparing myself mentally and emotionally and getting some more structure going into the defense. And so I focused on writing up some notes and reviewing important critical texts I referenced in my dissertation. I made outlines of my chapters to be sure that I could explain how everything in the whole dissertation fit together. I spent a bit of time practicing answering potential questions, and I spent a lot of time practicing my opening remarks. The format of the defense was that I would open with no more than 10 minutes of a presentation explaining the evolution of my research, my core arguments, and what potential future directions my work might take. And after that, it was about an hour and 20 minutes of my 4 committee members taking turns questioning me. I was, to some extent, able to predict the kind of questions that I would be asked in general and the kinds of things each of my committee members would be particularly interested in. But really, the thing that I was most able to control and prepare for were those opening remarks. So I put a lot of time into making sure that those were as solid as possible. And on Thursday, the day before the defense, I did spend a bit of time working, but mostly I tried really hard to relax. This past 3 weeks of preparing for the defense, and really the past couple months of getting to this finish line, had me more physically stressed and exhausted than I really had ever been in my life. And so I wanted to take this last day to accept the fact that all the work of preparation realistically had already been done. And at this point, I needed to clear my mind, physically relax, and be able to feel strong and rested going into the defense. And so I spent Thursday doing relaxing, restorative things. I spent the morning reading and then going grocery shopping, one of my favorite hobbies, and made a massive batch of extra hydrating cucumber water so I could feel like I was at a spa. I spent a couple more hours working just to make sure everything was really fresh in my mind and I could work through my opening remarks comfortably without relying too much on my printed out script so that I wasn't staring down and reading, but rather was able to speak more fluently. I went outside and went for a nice long walk by the river to kind of relax my mind, get some fresh air, tire myself out a little bit because I was really worried that I would have a hard time falling asleep from anxiety, and just kind of have that restorative time spent looking at green things and hearing moving water. And I spent some very important time just sitting on my couch, painting my nails and watching Legally Blonde so that I could get in my most powerful, confident girl boss mindset. And then before I knew it, it was the day of the defense. I didn't record any of the actual defense. I decided that I didn't want to feel that pressure of the idea of how my defense might be perceived by a wider audience, as much as I have really appreciated and found great value in this kind of online cohort that I have been placed into by sharing my academic journey, I decided that the defense itself would just be for me and the friends and family of mine who were there with me. What I did record was the last run-through I did of my opening remarks, which I did with less than an hour to go before the defense. This was actually the most anxious that I was the entire week, including during the defense itself. I became much more calm during the defense. But in watching these remarks, you can see how I started off setting myself up for a defense that ended in me passing. My dissertation is a study of what I call sinister hospitality, which very simply put is the expectation for early modern audiences that hospitality creates the conditions for dysfunction and harm, despite being upheld in discourse of the time as a moral imperative. We can see this idea of hospitality as a moral duty being expressed in a text like Caleb Dalechamp's extensive outlining of how to uphold hospitality in accordance with Christian virtue. The importance of hospitality is also identified in many of the royal proclamations issued by the 3 successive monarchs whose reigns fall within my research, who directed the nobility and gentry to return from London back to their country house estates in order to there uphold their responsibility to dispense hospitality to their surrounding communities. What texts like this begin to illustrate for us is that rather than having the more narrow definition that we might associate with hospitality today of a private welcoming of an individual into the personal domestic space of one's home, hospitality instead had widely understood moral weight and a real social function. And at times, the literary representations of hospitality do uphold that positive view of hospitality as ethical and as socially reifying. This is what we see in the moment from As You Like It, which I used to open my introduction, in which the exiled Duke welcomes Orlando to join him as a guest, and in doing so feeds the hungry and smooths over a moment of potential conflict. We also see this in Johnson's depiction of the Penshurst estate as so perpetually ready to receive guests that it functions as this kind of beacon of hospitality when King James happens to be wandering by. But often, and sometimes even within these idealized versions of hospitality, we see an anxiety that hospitality is corruptible and threatening. That, as Felicity Heel argues in her historical review of the subject, the idea of hospitality is inseparable from the idea of loss and failure. And this is what is shown over and over again in the texts I showcase throughout this dissertation. That hospitality is legible to the early modern English audience as a signal that something significant is going to happen, but that this something significant is likely to be some form of dysfunction, ranging from manipulation and infidelity to cannibalism, regicide, and murder. And this trend of hospitality being presented as unstable and dangerous is reflective of that anxiety Felicity Heel identifies over the decay of hospitality and contributes to this idea that I identify across early modern English texts of hospitality holding a sinister rather than a positive implication. I began my work in hospitality first through what started as a study of food production in Milton's Paradise Lost. In this scene in Book 5, Raphael has come to the Garden of Eden, and when Eve is preparing a meal for him, we can see her thinking strategically about how she can use this situation of entertaining a guest in order to distinguish herself. My research on this scene brought me to see how explicitly framing Eve as a hostess enables a productive way of thinking about things like domestic labor and authority. Shortly after this initial introduction, rather than invitation, to hospitality, I was studying Macbeth and found that rereading this very familiar text with the new lens of hospitality in place directed my attention towards moments in the text and towards questions that I might not have otherwise considered. I also started at this time thinking about hospitality as a performance, both in a theatrical sense, as in kind of this theater of hospitality with conventional props and scripts and archetypal roles into which participants were cast, but also hospitality as performance in a deceptive sense of a performative show of hospitality which can conceal underlying intentions. My research around this time also brought me to see how hospitality and theater are in fact frequently presented as intertwined in early modern texts, with hospitality being held as theatrical and theater as hospitable. And so with these core set of ideas in place of hospitality as performative, representations reflecting but also distorting real early modern English practices, and all of this being shaded over by that anxiety of decay, with this in mind, I began reading a broad sampling of commercial plays where hospitality is present and is connected to harm or dysfunction. From this original sampling of texts, I then narrowed to these texts highlighted here, which are the ones I discuss over the course of my dissertation. I'm using these texts in order to illustrate how this sinister implication hangs over the idea of hospitality in early modern England, and to highlight in each one of these chapters one related area of social concern which converges with that overall trend I see of sinister hospitality in specific ways. And of course, throughout the dissertation, I also draw in texts from a range of other genres in order to illustrate how this anxiety over potential harm occurring during hospitality is not just a trope specific to drama, but rather is deeply embedded in the idea of hospitality at the time. The contribution that my dissertation makes to existing research on this subject lies in this breadth of texts, but specificity of focus that I am working with. There is existing scholarship which overlaps with mine in different ways, of course. Things like Daryl Palmer's book, Hospitable Performances, which is broadly about hospitality in early modern English theater, with one chapter that touches on what I would call dysfunctional or sinister hospitality. On the other side, we have something like James Heffernan's Hospitality and Treachery, which is broadly about what I might call dysfunctional hospitality, but with only one chapter on early modern literature, and even then it is a chapter confined to Shakespeare. What my work provides is this in-depth look specifically at dysfunction and the sinister across an array of early modern dramatic texts. In my future work, building off of this dissertation, there are a few areas I see as having potential for expansion. One potential direction could be to expand out to the periods before and after my focus here. I think that looking at hospitality during the Civil War and the Restoration would be especially productive, given that the Civil War did so heavily shift ideas around the home and the state and neighbors, and also dramatically shifted the tradition of theater in England as well. And so it would be really interesting to track how a lot of the ideas I outline in my dissertation bear out in literature of the later 17th century. I also think that the hostess is a really exciting area to expand my research, and I would say is an area that has been pretty drastically overlooked in previous scholarship. I have made an effort to talk about the hostess beyond just that first chapter where I spend the most time. I revisit the figure of the hostess in chapters 2 and 3 as well, but even with that, I would really say that I've only scratched the surface of this, and I would love to go into it in more detail in the future. Whatever direction my future research does take, I find so much value in the study of hospitality in general, as this way to think about ethics, power dynamics, boundaries between private and public, and the self and other. Hospitality does have this very specific set of implications and definitions in early modern England, but also has this broader relevance beyond just this narrow historical context, or beyond really any historical or cultural context. And I look forward to continuing to work with this subject. I've been feeling really stable all day, but I just doing that last run through, the nerves hit me. I'm very nervous, but excited, and it's gonna be fine. I think I'm about to black out during the presentation, during the whole defense. It's gonna be fine. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be great. This is it. That actually went pretty well. Oh hey, it's me, Dr. Carson Brackey, Glutenberg Bible, PhD. I had been so excruciatingly nervous in that hour leading up to the defense, and once the defense actually began and I gave my opening remarks, my nerves kind of went away a little bit. I felt more confident. I felt comfortable with the people who were in the room, my 4 advisors, but also some of my friends and family who were there watching and kind of cheering me on, and the defense ended up going even better than I had hoped. I felt really comfortable, I felt capable of speaking to everything, and it was a really productive conversation with these 4 scholars and advisors whose work I really admire and who have helped me so much throughout these years of grad school, and so it just felt really good. And that was all that I wanted, was to feel like the defense had been an appropriate, triumphant kind of end to this very long process. I wanted to be able to look back on it and think I did the best that I could have done, and I showed well the amount of effort I had put into this. I passed with no revisions. They did have advice for things that I could change, and a couple of things that they were really strongly recommending that I do change before I officially deposit the dissertation. But passing with no revisions means that I don't need to send it back out to them for approval before I do that. I can just take a few days, make these changes, and then deposit it. So I did it. All I have to do is officially deposit my dissertation, and I'm done. I have my PhD. I'm just gonna go read a book for fun with no stress.